Nearly a decade ago, I began a service with an invocation that lifted up our veterans, and then later in the service, I specifically asked the veterans in our midst to please rise, much as I did today, and to be thanked and acknowledged. I thought it was kind of a common act, I had assumed at the time, but as I began those words of invitation, I noted an audible gasp from within the congregation. The service continued. We lit candles for each of those veterans who indicated a willingness to be recognized. After the service, a man in his 70s made a beeline for me before I could even make my way to the place where I normally stood to shake hands and offer hugs. I felt my body kind of tighten in the way in which one does when a gale force wind is coming at you. Next thing I knew, I was receiving a hug that nearly bowled me over, while this typically austere man wept on my shoulder, wept through 3 layers of fabric. When he looked up at last, he could barely choke out the words, "Thank you. I have been a Unitarian Universalist my whole life, and I've never been recognized as a veteran." He waved in my direction with a desire to say more and yet an inability in the swell of the moment. Later, I would learn of how brutally he was treated upon his return home. Even good progressives who would fall silent when he entered the circle of a conversation. I must admit that I did not understand then, as a relative newcomer to Unitarian Universalism, the pain or particular history around veterans and war in many of our congregations. We tended, as a denomination in the 1960s forward, to be generally dominated by voices calling for peace, many of whom at various points had been veterans themselves. But as the decades went on, in some cases because of the economic privilege of our historic Unitarian congregations, the number of veterans were smaller, and the class bias led to a sometimes unnuanced position against war, an invisibility of those who served. I would love to take credit for my radical act of inclusion a decade ago, but at best, it was an accidental act. One that has led me to nearly a decade of discernment. Giving praise. It costs us little to nothing to give praise, to offer thanks, to honor. And yet, with praise, we humans have the unique ability to choose what to bless in the world, and equally with our silence, what to curse. Praise can destroy as surely as it can build up. It can be used and is oft used by the greatest tyrants for a false worship of self and the destruction of the most prescient values in our democracy. Values that threaten dictators alongside the ordinary magnitude of our own biases. On Wednesday, I spent the day in Washington, D.C., a place that I love to be in very much, even now. And yet more and more as I am there and I see Make America Great Again hats touring the nation's capital, I am noting internally and among religious progressives a guardedness, a queasiness around the language of patriotism. The songs of our country eliciting the shame of broken promises and the fear of becoming a warmonger, swearing allegiance to a tyrant. Moreover, those of us who know the history of stolen land, the genocides of indigenous people, and the kidnapping and enslavement of Africans, alongside the race lies that divided and continue to divide poor whites from allies in revolt and rebellion, knowing this history can make patriotism seem an absurd endeavor. We are gathered on the lands of the Lenni Lenape people who were decimated by first settlers, some of those same settlers who later fought for an independence from a tyrannical government. This new government was buoyed by broken tribes and violent policies and acts espoused by some of the supposed heroes of the founders of this government. Moreover, some of these very early figures built the economy of this country and continue to do so today on the backs of brown and black folks. Knowing this environmental injustice alongside social injustice, how can we possibly even consider ourselves to be patriots, lovers, devotees of this country? I believe we must do so. Because whether you believe war is ever justified or not, you must believe in the humanity of those who have served this country. Because whether you believe this country is a perfect union or not, surely you can see the hope embedded in the single greatest experiment in democracy we have known as a human species, a democracy that is not bound by race or ethnicity, that finds the center of its identity circle beyond the scope of those circles that so often in the history of humanity bend toward nationalism and war. Despite all the fundamental flaws, not to mention a constitution created without representation from all the residents in these United States of America, despite all of it, liberation has had and has a way, even in the most extraordinary cases of deprivation, to survive and in moments to burst through and thrive. Indeed, in the words of Benjamin Franklin, who when asked in 1787 as he left the Constitutional Convention, "Well, doctor, do we have a monarchy or a republic?" replied with earnest depth, "A republic if you can keep it." In this day and time, in such a time as this, is it possible for religious progressives to espouse patriotism? Patriotism, the sense of love or devotion to one's country, the origin of the word is admittedly not entirely helpful to my cause. Coming from patris, meaning father, it's about devotion to the fatherland. And before you flee for the exits, know this: patriotism, despite its lineage and its origin, in its earliest inception, was not about a defined sense of chauvinism or excessive accumulation of defensive devotion, but rather about obligation, belonging, commitment, citizenship. Contrasted with nationalism, which seeks to build up the nation-state's power at the expense of other countries. Think my land is best and superior only if other lands are decimated. Patriotism instead can sing the virtues and responsibilities of a place and a people with the ability to singularly and simultaneously sing the praises and the virtues of other countries as well. Nationalism inevitably ends in isolationism, whereas patriotism, at its best, ought to lead to interdependence within a country and as global citizens in the world. When I was in North Carolina, I had the honor of meeting a veteran named Mark. His entire life had been shaped in many ways by his service and time in Vietnam. The emotional and mental trauma of that war stayed with him for his entire life. And the physical impact of exposure to Agent Orange, we all believe, cost him his life far too early, at the age of 62. When I met Mark, he was legally blind. He grew up in what would be considered a conservative part of the country, in a conservative community. By all measures, he should have been formed into a neat political voting pattern. But Mark reminded me again and again that humans are never that easy. He loved his country. He was a patriot. And he was the most radically inclusive human I have yet to meet. Because of Mark, I began meeting veterans at the VA hospital in Salisbury, North Carolina, and a few folks began coming to the congregation, and soon a ministry emerged out of that. When my spouse, Anne Marie, and I got married, it was Mark who, without physical vision, took yarn that he had spun himself and wove it into a beautiful tapestry with a heart in the center. It remains one of the most precious wedding gifts and gifts, period, I have received in my life, and it blesses our home to this day. True patriots, beloved, may be the only way we can keep this country. Our spiritual legacy includes the earliest founders of this country alongside the persistent prophetic and patriotic voices that urged us to endeavor to be, in the words of Langston Hughes, the America we yet could be. As Hughes writes, oh yes, I say it plain, America never was America to me. And yet I swear this oath, America will be. Out of the rack and the ruin of our gangster death, the rape and rot of graft and stealth and lies, we the people must redeem. The land, the mines, the plants, the rivers, the mountains in the endless plain. All the stretch of these great green states, and make America again. I was reminded recently of the story from the writer Francis O'Connor, which was made famous by President Kennedy, who utilized it in order to push us toward the moon. O'Connor details his childhood as a boy in Ireland in the book As an Only Child. In his own words, as a boy, he and friends would make their way across the countryside. And when they came to an orchard wall that seemed a little too high or too doubtful or too difficult to permit their voyage to continue, well, they would take off their hats and they would toss them over the wall. And then they had no choice but to follow. Progressives today need to throw their caps over the wall if we are to endeavor to keep this republic. Progressives, the ones who are unrepentant about protest and critique, who love you the only way we know how, by making us all better together. by telling our truth and praising not as some abject lesson in polite politicking to control, but praise full-bellied, open-handed, loud clapping until the projection of perfect gets shattered into the mosaic that is real, bountiful, and ever more beautiful. In a country where on any given night over 40,000 of those sleeping in the streets are veterans, we have got to toss our cap over the wall. In a time when the Senate sells off Oak Flats, Arizona, our veritable Mount Sinai on this continent, to a multinational copper mining company that will put where Oak Flats is today a 2-mile crater of toxic waste, where the Apache for generations have buried their beloved and honored their young women coming of age. We have got to toss our cap over the wall. In a truth where Flint still doesn't have clean water, and the waters drawn here from Newark and Elizabeth are poisoning our children with lead. We have got to toss our cap over the wall.
Preach.
In a context where children can be schooled to add the day's now complex math, 2,328 days that Mitch McConnell has failed to put the Voting Rights Act before the Senate and has allowed voter suppression to begin to be promulgated as law of the land once more, we progressives have got to toss our caps
over the wall.
In a moment when the president maneuvers to disgrace the fundamental character of the Constitution, and where he continues to occupy an office while disgracing the dream of who we can be and replacing it with the most base nationalistic nightmare of our founders, we have got to toss our cap
over the wall.
Too many have died, been murdered, wiped out, and decimated for any of us to even quietly whisper plans of moving to Canada or uttering such a joke. Shame on us in this season of strife and suffering. We hold our cap and wonder at the height of the wall. We have to toss it past our uncertainties, past our fear of what our ancestors and generations before us have tried and could not do, past our false praise to the messy and the mistaken, the forgotten and the begotten. Praise we sing this day. Praise for the poet who protests with truth and word. Praise for the soldier who wagers and weaves peace and defies tokenization by a false king. Praise for the activist who holds all manner of pain and trauma and terror. Praise for the worker who will not be denied their fair share and fair wage. Praise for the mother who defends her child against policy violence and demands health care. Praise for the undocumented seeker who places the promise of safety before the ideologue of fear. Praise for the transgender teenager who resists the militarization of their body. Praise for the ones in service who rise each day to tasks mundane and unnoticed, who weave a world with a sight that is drawn from the soul. Praise for the communities that go all in. Praise for the cohorts tipping hats over the wall. Praise for the souls climbing even now. Praise for the ancestors who whisper, hush. Hush to the clang of nationalism. Hush to the roar of the ideologues. Hush. Beneath the band, there is a beat older than these wars, taller than your temples, stronger than your tyrants. Hush, she calls once more. Across these amber waves of grain, America. Let her be lifted. Let us be lifted to who we may yet and must be.
Amen.